What we're talking about is Tony Hall, who was chief executive of BBC News at the time. He then went on to become the director general, I believe, later. But at this time, he was chief executive BBC News. Goes into a board of governors meeting. Now, he knew that Martin Bashir had done these forgeries. He knew that Martin Bashir had actually lied 3 times, but then broke down in tears and confessed to Tony Hall. Then he goes into this Board of Governors meeting, says how wonderful Martin Bashir is and wax lyrical about them, didn't give them the heads up on any of it, and then points out Matt Wiesler as one of the villains that is going to be black banned from the BBC for the rest of his life. Now, the board of directors, there's one that was still alive that spoke to Andy Webb, Richard Eyre, and right. He said, if we had have known, then Diana would have been briefed, told about the forgeries. She would have been briefed and told about Martin Bashir lying, whereupon she probably wouldn't have lost Patrick Jeffson, would
exactly
she?
So. Exactly so. And I travelled the world with Patrick to do a series in 2003. And this tormented him, still does, that he lost his relationship with a woman to whom he was very loyal over these lies. And she went to her grave thinking he'd betrayed her for money, and he hadn't. And yes, had the BBC in 96, while Diana's still alive, had said, I'm sorry, Mum, there's been an awful... We now realise that Martin span you all these things and there's nothing wrong with Patrick and the others, then that may have changed everything. And she may have set her life on a different course. It is completely inexcusable. And it goes to another part, because I'm actually in the book. There's a paragraph about me in Andy's book, because I had a drink in Sydney with Steve Hewlett. That's the editor of Panorama. And it was a bit like my meeting with Tony Hall, but with more alcohol involved. So maybe more honesty. So Steve knew that I was friends with Harry and the others. He knew we were not, we didn't necessarily agree about this, but it was late at night. We were having drinks. And he said to me, effectively, he still didn't know the full story of how Martin had got Diana's confidence. I don't think he knew anything about that fax, for example. I don't think he knew anything about what he said about Tiggy Leg Bork, for example. But I got the strong sense from Steve that he feared something would yet come out that would sink them all. And because he died, actually, Steve, much admired, before Andy Webb revealed the truth. But, it's an extraordinary thing. But he still, I have to be fair to Steve, he still believed what Tony Hall said, which is Diana would have done it anyway. Your friends, Phil, they're just jealous. They'd have done the same. It was a scoop of the century. Any journalist worth his salt cuts a few corners, don't they, to get a story like that? So they're jealous colleagues. She would have done it anyway. And that was the defense that they held until Andy drove the bulldozer through it. And he drove the bulldozer through it. Sorry, I was just saying, the bulldozer he drove through it was getting Charles Spencer's notes and that fax. And everything that we didn't know back in 96, but we didn't know, which was that he talked about the paying off the staff, that Tiggy Leg Bork was pregnant, that Charles wanted to have both Diana and Camilla assassinated. All this kind of mad stuff. And none of that had come out then. And that's why the defense held for so long.
Yeah. My point about Tony Hall was, well, there's 2 points I want to ask you. One, that's not true, because journalists on Panorama and people that you worked with wouldn't go as far as to forge documents to convince people that they were under threat in order to do an interview. So that just doesn't fly, what Tony Hall implied about that. But also Tony Hall, everyone's blaming Martin Bashir, as they should, and I'm gobsmacked he hasn't faced any sort of prosecution at all. But Tony Hall's sitting in the House of Lords. And it could be argued that he is as much to blame in not exposing this in time in order for Diana to be properly briefed. Because I said to Andy Webb, well, he stood up and he lied in the board of directors meetings, and Andy corrected me and said, no, he didn't. He admitted to tell the truth. He admitted information. I don't really see that, qualification there. I guess there would be a legal line there.
It's it's just
House of Lords, what's going on?
it's the
Pretty much everyone connected with that story got a gong.
I know it's the cynicism of it that's so offensive. Because you're absolutely right. No, most journalists on Panorama or any other program wouldn't forge documents, wouldn't make up stories about you're going to get murdered, wouldn't say that your estranged husband's having a baby with your nanny, wouldn't say those things. And that's why my friends who stood up and said, we're the BBC. That means something. This is Panorama. That means something. And you guys have trashed it. And in response to that, Tony Hall comes along with a great big brush, pushes it under the carpet, and heads off to the House of Lords. Welcome to Britain.
Yeah, and people that haven't read the book might also realise that Martin Bashir showed Diana an invoice or a bill from the clinic that supposedly gave her an abortion. Now, this was all not true, of course, and Tiggy Leg Burke was actually compensated when all this came out. I think she got £250,000. But I mean, the distress she went through because of these lies is just, beyond comprehension. But Diana was actually shown an invoice from the so-called abortion clinic, and that is why she went up and whispered in Tiggy's ear, "I'm sorry about the baby," at the Christmas party. Now, that made Diana look really mean and vindictive and horrible. But if someone showed me an invoice of, my husband's supposed mistress had just had an abortion and showed me what looked like a completely legitimate invoice from that, I would tend to, I probably wouldn't believe it with my husband, but I mean, it would be compelling, wouldn't it? It would make you think twice.
It's funny when you try to, and I wrote the book with these two things in my mind, trying to balance the moments, certainly in the latter years, when Diana really was quite unreasonable and sometimes a bit scary, because this is all happening around the time that she's making these nuisance calls to Oliver Hoare, with the fact that she was also, A, she had lots of reasons to be a bit paranoid, and B, she was still doing her job really, really well. You could argue better than her husband. And all those things, people are messy, people are complicated. It's a shame that she believed that stuff. I think her whole experience within the royal family primed her to see her world as a wilderness of mirrors, actually. And that's, I talked to you the other day, didn't I? I think we're going to talk about this in another program, about Charles's kind of mental landscape. And there's that great scene in The Crown where Diana's not with him. She probably doesn't even know where he is. He's gone hunting. And of course, Camilla's there, and all of their very sophisticated friends are all there. And they're telling these dirty jokes, the one about the bear hunt. And it's a great scene. It's beautifully filmed. But it really, I think, captures, there she is with a dinner on a tray, not entirely sure where her husband is. And there he is, the sophisticated man of the world, he's staying at the home of his mistress. And of course, the sleeping arrangements will be adjusted accordingly. And that's the world he lived in. And I think that Diana must have looked at her world and thought, nothing I see is true, And then she has her phone calls recorded and broadcast, and that would have made her feel paranoid. And then she has people turning up to take a picture unexpectedly. So I'm not trying to make excuses, because she clearly did have some mental health issues herself. I'm just trying to make people understand, if you saw the world through her eyes, a lot of what she saw and believed did seem reasonable.
Yeah. Did you know Anne Sloman?
I did. Not well.
All right, because she was sort of the investigator that Tony Hall, I mean, the BBC did an internal, when all this started coming up in 1996, everyone, the BBC did an internal investigation. Are internal investigations the investigations you have when you don't want to have an investigation?
Yeah. And the famous BBC phrase, deputy heads will roll. And it's not Stalinist Russia. Nobody was taken out and shot. Well, I guess the graphic designer was fired. But people like my friend, they found their careers suddenly not working out as well as they'd hoped. They didn't get the jobs they would have expected. They were sent down sort of tram lines. And it was, like I say, it was an example of the establishment looking out for itself. And the BBC is as much a part of the establishment as anybody else.
There's a really chilling line. Anne Sloman did a memo. There's lots of memos that Andy Webb actually uncovered. And this is really important, everyone, because all of these had disappeared all the documentation had gone, and his 3-year court battle forced them to hand over all this information. And there was a memo from Anne Sloman, and there's a chilling final line to her internal report. It says this: "The Diana story is probably now dead unless Spencer talks."
I know.
Unless, because they knew Charles Spencer had proof.
They did.
And, you know, that's just so chilling, isn't it?
It is, and it's just, I don't, you probably haven't seen it, and they've tried to take it offline. But in 2005, these same people made a show for the 10th anniversary of the interview. It's so oily and cloyingly self-congratulatory. They're all lining up to pat themselves on the back. All of these characters who are now exposed as covering it up are up there on screen, so desperately pleased with themselves. And I remember watching it at the time thinking, God, you got away with it, didn't you? Yeah. And then that's why I'm so grateful personally. And I know people like Patrick are hugely. I mean, I was at Andy's book launch in London, and Patrick, who's not well, joined by a video link. And it was a very tearful moment. What he said is how much he appreciated, and so many others did, that after all these years, somebody had found the truth and had fought through this legal miasma, £1 million of British taxpayers' money to protect the BBC from its own misdeeds. I mean, they should all go, and they certainly shouldn't be in the House of Lords, in my opinion.